Welcome back to the weekend with Anthony Opperman. Time again for our wildlife segment. Welcome back inside the Sports Radio 910 studio from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, Chris Dunnavant. Of course, last weekend, Chris joined us from the Fishing Expo up at Meadow Event Park. Got him back in the studio this weekend. And Chris, I kind of wanted to talk about some of the things that you and I saw and observed and were able to experience at the Fishing Expo. Of course, you joined us live there in the morning. I had the opportunity to come and hang out with you for a couple hours in the afternoon, and there were definitely some things that stood out to me that I wanted to kind of recap and discuss with you. And first and foremost, I had the opportunity to meet a couple of professional anglers, both of them native Virginians, John Cruz from here locally, and then also David Dudley from Lynchburg. And it's interesting to see these guys because they definitely, in talking with them, have some things in common.
No doubt.
In addition to being professional fishing anglers, but also a couple of guys who, in some respects, couldn't be more the opposite. And I wanted to start with John. And, of course, one of his big things at the Fishing Expo was pushing his new line of bait that he had helped design. And just in talking to him about that and getting some background about him from you, about the process and what he's done to design some of these baits, going from literally hand-drawn sketches to having these baits produced, it really seems like he's a very calculated guy, and he really has thought through the profession.
Absolutely. I've known John for since he began, and I was out there fishing when he was starting fishing, and I got to know him out there. And there's no doubt, just spending a little bit of time with him, he's a very calculated, articulate guy, very detailed, specific, very thoughtful about everything he does. And talking to him about the design of his baits, even his new plastics company, Missile Baits, is his company. So he's designed every detail for those worms, including every measurement, but also the salt consistency and the density of the plastics for each bait is different. And even the lures he designs for Spros, crankbaits, he tweaks every little millimeter of those baits. And that also translates into his fishing. He's very, methodical and planned, gets his tackle ready weeks in advance, does a lot of study, and just has a very systematic way he approaches his fishing. And that's just his personality. And also on top of that, of course, which the successful pros all have that competitive desire, that really desire to win and to compete, and he has that too, and he's a fierce competitor out there.
There was something that he had brought up when talking with a young amateur angler, and the discussion was about sponsors and trying to attract sponsors. And I know you and I were standing there as well, and you had to jump in on this one in addition to what he said and kind of support his remarks, because he said, don't worry about the sponsors, just worry about fishing and having the results in your fishing, and all the other stuff on the business side will take care of itself. Interesting, coming from a guy who now is obviously heavily involved in the business side.
Absolutely. And, I just wanted to take that opportunity to support John and what he was saying. Sometimes, a young person like he was talking to, they can hear something and just not really register. And I can speak from experience too, because when I was out there, I was so into wanting to get sponsors. And it's something about that. You want that recognition. It's kind of like, hey, I've arrived. It has some kind of definition of success to your peers. But really, in the long run, you're better off, if you're wanting to start out doing that, just to not worry about that. What I found in my experience, I had all these sponsors, and they were giving me product, but I was spending a lot of time with those sponsors and spending a lot of time trying to use their baits when I just should have been spending that time and energy using what I needed to use and focusing on becoming a better angler and fishing and focusing on my tournament success, and just not worry about having hats and patches and some kind of recognition. But it's hard. It's so tempting because other people, when you've got sponsors, they look and go, ooh, and it's really tempting. But John was just right on the nose, and I hope that young person and also any others that are here, that are listening or trying to want to be a pro, would heed his advice. Fish, fish hard, and do well, and the rest of those things will come into place.
Being joined by Chris Dunnavant from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, our weekly wildlife conversation here on the weekend with Anthony Opperman. And, Chris, you talk about fishing and fishing hard, and the other guy that we had an opportunity to talk to a little bit, David Dudley, well, that's just pretty much his life story, isn't it? I mean, this, you could just tell, and in talking to him, he said that, he played all three sports in high school, that he had opportunities to go continue to play sports at the collegiate level. But all he really wanted to do, when he sat down and thought about it, all he really wanted to do was just go fishing. And you could tell that drove him, and that's one of the things that stood out to me about him. The other thing, and this is something that he and John both seemingly have in common, the competitive nature. But as you pointed out, maybe hard-pressed to find another guy in the fishing world that is as competitive as a guy like David Dudley. I mean, he even talked about when we were standing there talking to him for 5 minutes, he picked up racquetball just because he wanted something to do to be able to compete.
That's right. I mean, I agree with you, Anthony, and it's very quickly, you just met him, and you in 5 minutes, I think you could pick that up. He is a competitive guy, and there is just a fire in him like very few others, and that's why he's considered one of the best, if not the best, in the world right now. He dominates the FLW Tour, the leading money winner, and has won championships and Angler of the Year titles, and he's just got to feed that competitiveness, and he just fishes all out. He fishes to win every time. He's not satisfied, and in fact, there's a little video piece of him that if he doesn't win, he's lost. Most people would think, hey, if I got a top 10, I did really well. I'm in there. I'm in the money. Here's a guy that he's not even satisfied. If he comes in fifth, he's like, 4 people beat me. I mean, that's his attitude. And, realistically, it's kind of like baseball. You can't hit the ball. Nobody's going to hit the ball every time they come up to the plate. You're going to lose more than you win. And fishing is even more so. If you win one tournament a year, you're fishing maybe a dozen professional tournaments or less. If you win one a year, that's an amazing feat. So you're going to lose more than you win. But to have that attitude, he has to maintain that attitude to put himself in the winner's circle as often as he does. And he's just going after it every time he gets on the water.
And again, that's evident between David and John. But probably the one thing that is the biggest difference, and this really didn't come up in our conversation with him last Saturday, but some stuff that you've kind of told me outside of that is just the fact that he is an unorthodox fisherman, at least in terms of like John Cruz being very calculated, studying. David Dudley, complete opposite of that.
Right. David just is instinctive fisherman, and people that in the sport, that admire that and respect that have pointed that out. He's one of the most, and I noticed it when I was out there fishing. I remember tournaments where he just amazed me because he would just so fish instinctively and be able to figure those fish out like nobody had ever seen. I knew it back then years ago, and it's just living true to this day. But he doesn't spend time in the pre-planning and the map study and and all that. He goes to the water. He has a very simplified system for his colors of lures and his bait selection, and he's very big in the mental aspect. He wants to clear his mind up that he can focus on the fish, and he just goes to that lake or river, fishes the current conditions, and just lives for that moment and reads the conditions and follows his instincts and finds those fish, and he's probably one of the most successful at doing that. So definitely a different approach, and what I've learned is that if somebody were to go and then try to duplicate that and follow David Dudley's style, they may not be successful. Everybody has different personalities and different ways they go about things, and David just knows who he is and knows how to go about it, and he's staying true to it, and obviously the results speak for themselves.
No, that's a really good point. Joined by Chris Dunnavant from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, our weekly wildlife conversation here on the weekend with Anthony Opperman. And Chris, before we run out of time on this segment, there was obviously the other big talk of the show was that state record striper that was caught that Friday and was on display at the show. And I mean, I know that was a big deal to everybody there.
Yes.
And it was kind of cool, the timing, that they were able to have the actual fish at the show for people to see. But what was also interesting was the fact that, and when you and I chatted last Saturday, details were just first starting to come out about the who, when, and how, and all of that stuff. But the backstory behind this fish and the way it was caught, really interesting.
Absolutely. You know, yeah, it was really good timing there, wasn't it? It's almost like it was planned. It was perfect. And but yeah, I got a chance to sit down with the angler who caught it. He came to the show on Sunday and did a little interview with him. And, you know, the neat story is this is a regular guy. He chartered that trip with his father and brother-in-law a week before, and he's only done that a couple times. He's a freshwater fisherman. He lives in Manassas, and he fishes a lot of freshwater, Potomac River. And he's just a regular guy, and he charters a boat, goes fishing. He's chartered with a pro, you know, with a guide, and he now is a state record holder. And I think that's just such a neat thing that, you know, some species, freshwater or salt, you may have to be a real student of that fish to probably catch the big one. I know in bass fishing, since I don't tournament fish anymore, I've tried to focus on catching bigger fish, and you have to really think differently to catch bigger fish. You got to do some different things, and I've learned that and getting better at that. But, you know, this is such a neat deal. Anybody can have a chance. You book a trip with this guide, you get out there on the Chesapeake Bay or out in the ocean there, and you go along, and he's been on the water, he's communicating, he's in touch with what's happening to fish, and you get a chance to catch a state record. And I think that's just one of the neat stories that, you know, book one of those trips. It could be you. You could be the guy, you know, on the newspaper article holding your fish up. It's pretty neat.
I know Jay Moore asked last weekend, and I didn't have an exact answer for him, but what do you think he's going to do with the fish?
Well, I actually got a chance to talk to him, and just to reiterate that this is just a regular guy, he's not looking for glory. He was like, I'm going to take it home and clean it up and put it, you know, eat it and put it in the freezer. I mean, he's planning on, you know, and, you know, he said he didn't really have the money to probably mount it, but one of the nice things is he can take pictures of it and measurements, and if that ever opportunity does come up, he can always have a replica made. And that's what most people do now anyway. But yeah, he was just like, I'm going to eat it. You know, are you kidding? You know, so that's what his plan was.
How long do you think that fish is going to last? I mean, how many freezer bags can you fill up with that state record fish, 74 pounds?
I tell you what, if he has a big family, then that's something. But if he doesn't, then I think his friends are probably going to be getting a lot of striper fillets in the next coming weeks, I'm sure. Because I don't know how you can eat that much fish in a year's time. So he's got plenty of meat.
Chris Dunnavant from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, our weekly wildlife conversation. Chris, wanted to thank you again for taking the time to show me around the Fishing Expo. You know, it's one thing to go to these events just as the casual fisherman, but it's another thing to walk around with a guy like Chris Dunnavant because, I mean, that is like being with a superstar at the event. I tell you, you impressed me. Everybody stopping and wanting to talk to Chris, and I know the very first show we put him through a test to see if we had a guy who was certainly an expert in this field. You just go hang out with Chris Dunnavant at the Fishing Expo, you know that you're in good company, especially here in the state of Virginia.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Well, I'm just really fortunate. I'm blessed. I have a lot of good friends out there, know a lot of folks, and the job that I have, and of course fishing before that has afforded me the opportunity to meet a lot of people, and I tell you, it's one of the things that I really love about this sport. Probably the most important thing to me is the folks that are out there that I've gotten to meet, to know, the friendships that I've developed and cultivated. It's just one of the best things about it. So I really enjoy that.
And Chris Dunnavant from the Virginia Department of Game and Inland Fisheries, our weekly wildlife conversation. When we come back, got your game plan for the weekend as you pass the time until Super Bowl Sunday.
The show is almost over, but the weekend is just getting started. More of The Weekend with Anthony Opperman is next on Sports Radio 910.